good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarvavide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back. We continue our study of chapter 11, Ikshitratva. What a tongue twister is the title of the chapter, and it means the state of being the observer. Ikshana is seeing. The state of being a witness, the state of being observer, like sakshi. Most of you know the term sakshi, a wareful witness. So that is I won't say it's a topic for the whole chapter, as I mentioned last week. It happens to be the first word of the first verse, and there's a convention where if you don't know how to name your chapter, name it after the first word of the first verse. We discussed last week. What's interesting about that word, though, is it really differentiates the teachings of Advaita Vedanta as not being philosophy. Many people make this mistake. They look at this body of teachings we call Advaita Vedanta, and they think this is a philosophy, and it bears some similarities perhaps to some other kinds of philosophies. But that's quite incorrect, and for reasons that you probably already know because we've discussed this, and that is philosophy deals with knowledge in an abstract way. Philosophy is literally the pursuit of knowledge. Here, the very term ikshitratva refers to something in your experience. To observe is an experience. To witness is experiential. To be awareful, to be conscious, is experiential. So the focus of Advaita Vedanta is on experience and not knowledge in an abstract way, and experience in general, but a particular experience. And if I ask you, actually, this will confuse almost everyone. What experience is Advaita Vedanta meant to address? And if you're thinking of the experience of Brahman, it's a big mistake, because Brahman is not something you can experience. The experience Advaita Vedanta addresses is the experience of suffering. That's what this whole teaching is about. So it examines our experience, and especially how suffering arises in our experience. Then we have all these wonderful teachings to address that problem in our experience. So the focus being on experience is interesting introduction to the next verse. Let's recite the next verse and then we'll talk about it. Swapna satyo yatha bodhat, swapna satyo yatha bodhat, dehatmatvam tathaiva cha, dehatmatvam tathaiva cha, pratyakshade pramanatvam, pratyakshade pramanatvam, Jagrat syaratma vedanat, Jagrat syaratma vedanat. Before we see the verse, let's look at an issue. So we've already put the focus on experience. Advaita Vedanta says that there is only one non-dual reality that exists, called Brahman. That's what Vedanta says. What does your experience say? in terms of your own personal experience, is a reality non-dual? Look around you, non-dual Brahman. In terms of experience, we can't deny the fact we experience duality. So how do we reconcile these two? And that, by the way, is really what Vedanta is all about. Vedanta is a re-examination of our experience to find out where we have misinterpreted our experience in ways that lead to suffering. I'd like to say that again because it's an unusual but very powerful definition of what Vedanta is. Vedanta is a methodology of analyzing your ordinary experience to help you understand how you have misunderstood that experience, misinterpreted that experience, and how those misinterpretations lead to suffering. By removing the misinterpretations of experience, suffering is removed. This is a wonderful way of understanding what Advaita Vedanta is. Certainly not an abstract philosophy. So that brings us back here. Vedanta says what exists is non-dual Brahman, but we experience duality. How do we resolve that? So based on what I just said, you might suppose that what we experience right now, sitting in this room, we misinterpret this experience. Is it possible that we could misinterpret this experience? You've perhaps seen my examples before. We misinterpret ordinary experiences all the time. You remember that I've given this example before. This table is made of atoms. Atoms are almost entirely empty space. My hand is made of atoms, which are almost entirely empty space. Empty space and empty space. Huh? How do we have this experience, but the experience needs to be properly interpreted? And the experience for the scientific-minded, the electrons in the outer layer of atoms of the chair, of the table, and the electrons of the outer layer of atoms of my hand, those negatively charged electrons repel each other. That's the physics. That's why, otherwise, my hand would pass right through the table. Wouldn't that be cool? Fortunately, due to the laws of physics, that can never happen. Anyway, I'm sharing this with you to show that how our commonplace assumptions about what we experience are wrong. All of them. Including your conclusion that whatever we experience right now, this duality is real. That is a wrong conclusion, and that's what Shankara teaches in this verse. He uses a famous metaphor. He says, yatha, just as, abodhat, before you wake up. Before you wake up, swapnaha, a dream, seems satyaha, seems real, seems true. Welcome, Swamiji. Please have a seat. And as you remember, after our class today, we're going to invite Swamiji to give us a talk. So, back here. So, yatha, just as, abodhat, before you wake up, swapnaha, dream, seems satyaha. Imagine while you're in the dream, you look around you. It all looks real. You have a body in a dream. Body in the dream seems real, but then when you wake up, you discover that everything in the dream that you took as being real, you discovered after the fact that the world you experienced with your senses in the dream wasn't as real as it looked. The body you experienced in a dream wasn't as real as it seemed in the dream. That's what Shankara says here. Look at the last line. So first line was the drishtanta, the metaphor. The fourth line introduces the darshtanta, that which the metaphor represents. So yatha, just as, and in the last line, actually we say that tata eva is actually in the second line, but the sense is here to go down to the last line. So atma-vichara. By the way, for our Sanskrit students, I think it has to be atma-vichara. Because we had before abodhat, up to waking up. So here we have to have atma-vichara, and of course the a's merge anyway for our Sanskrit students. So atma-vichara means before atma-vichara, before enlightenment, before you discover your true nature as sat-chit-ananda atma. Before enlightenment, jagrat syat, the waking state, seems satya, going back up to the first line. So look at the metaphor. Just as before you wake up in a dream, everything in a dream seems absolutely real. When you wake up from the dream, you know it's not real. In the same way, right now in the waking state, everything seems very real until you wake up out of the sleep of ignorance. This is the metaphor. Ignorance, being in a state of ignorance is like being in a state of sleep. You are asleep to a higher reality. You fail to understand, to know, to appreciate a higher reality. So in that sense, we are kind of sleeping our way through life. You may have heard that kind of expression. In this case, sleeping your way through life means failing to appreciate there's a higher reality beyond that which you experience in the waking state. So before enlightenment, in this waking state, third line, pratyakshadehe pramanatvam satyam syat. We have to connect all of this stuff. The pratyaksha means your sense perception, adi, etc. There is the pramanatvam, which I can only translate as authoritativeness. I apologize for the complex word, but it is very precise and helpful. So you trust what you see. That is authoritativeness. So when you were in a dream, you trusted what you saw. You trusted that the elephant you saw in a dream actually existed. When you woke up, you learned, oh, I guess I can't trust my senses in a dream. That's exactly what Shankara is pointing out here. And that is, in the waking state, you place too much trust in your powers of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Wasn't that my example? If you place too much authoritativeness in your sense of touch, you will misinterpret this experience. Remember, table is almost a completely empty space. My hand is almost completely empty space. You cannot trust your senses, and this is so not counterintuitive, but it flies in the face of common thinking, ordinary thinking. Ordinary thinking means what you see is what you get. Not. We have to learn that what you see is interpreted by you. How many times have I given the sunset example? The sun doesn't go down. We misinterpret our experiences constantly. So here, in the waking state, we misinterpret our experience, what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. We also misinterpret Dehatmatvam tata eva, the dehatmatvam, the status of this is me, taking myself to be this body. This body seems very real. This world around us seems very real. All of this is a misinterpretation of your experience. Notice Vedanta would never say, oh, you don't experience duality. That goes against what we experience. Vedanta accepts the fact that we experience duality, but then it takes the extra step of helping us correctly interpret that experience. Just to wrap this up, this metaphor of the dream, I think a wonderful metaphor for being enlightened would be to have a lucid dream. Lucid dream means you are dreaming, but you know you're dreaming. Some people have that. I've never had that, but it occurs. So imagine, and if you haven't had such a thing, don't worry, just imagine. Imagine dreaming, but knowing it's a dream. And you're walking around and you're looking at that big elephant. And you know the elephant isn't real because you know it's a dream. You are enlightened with regard to your dream world. You don't take anything you experience in that dream world as being absolutely real because it's a lucid dream. You know it's a lucid dream. That's quite a good metaphor for enlightenment. Let's give you a little test. How does the experience of the world and body differ between you and an enlightened saint? How does their experience of world and body differ? If you can say not at all, you've understood. The experience is identical. The interpretation of the experience is completely different. So just as in a lucid dream, you know nothing out there is as real as me. This language is important. In a lucid dream, nothing out there is as real as me. Now, what about here? Waking state. Nothing out there is as real as your true nature, consciousness. You, that conscious being, are more real than the world and body, just as the dreamer is more real than the dream world. Okay, enough. Then. Vyomavat sarva bhutasto, Vyomavat sarva bhutasto, bhuta doshar vivarjitaha, bhuta doshar vivarjitaha, sakshi cheta guna shuddho, sakshi cheta guna shuddho, brahmaivasmiti kevalaha, brahmaivasmiti kevalaha. Start in the third line. Sakshi, Cheta. When I read this in my mind, Sakshi, Cheta, Kevalo, Nirgunascha. Shankaracharya here is paraphrasing from the Shweta-shvatara Upanishads. He's just using the same words. Sakshi, as we just talked about, Ikshita, the observer. So here called Sakshi. Cheta, consciousness, one of many words for consciousness, but that Sakshi Cheta, the conscious observer means you, right? In a fundamental sense. You are that conscious observer, but now we get into what kind of conscious observer. And an enlightened person knows that that conscious observer is agunaha, same as nirguna, free from qualities, free from attributes, free from defects, free from limitation, free from suffering. And shuddhaha, pure means unaffected by anything else, not tainted, not affected by worldly experience. We've had this discussion before, that your consciousness is unchanging, and being unchanging, it cannot be affected by anything under any circumstances. Further, in the next line, Brahma eva asmi iti kevala, and there's the word kevala from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Brahma eva, Brahman alone, asmi, I am, iti kevalaha. Iti kevalaha, I am that alone and nothing else, iti kevalaha. Now, notice Shankara here is back to the first person, as we saw extensively in the last chapter. So the last chapter was all nididhyasana. We saw that for several classes, and Shankara made this brilliant use of the first person because, as we discussed, nididhyasana only occurs in the first person. There's no such thing as second person. When I say first person, you know I'm using a grammatical terminology, right? First person means I, me, grammatically. There's no such thing as second person nididhyasana. There's no such thing as third person nididhyasana. It's always I. I am Brahman. So that statement like that can be used for nididhyasana. But here, Shankara is using the first person not for the sake of nididhyasana. Don't think anything in first person is nididhyasana. That's not always true. So it is true that nididhyasana is always first person. But it's not true that first person is always nididhyasana. Here in this chapter, Shankara is teaching us. So we need to interpret these statements properly. So Shankara is making a statement for the sake of teaching us. Teaching us what? Well, that's in the first half of the verse. So first of all, when you say sakshi cheta, that is confirmed by your own experience. Then he says, agunaha and shuddhaha, that your consciousness is free from suffering and utterly unaffected by anything else. That, too, you can experientially confirm. But here where the teaching comes is in the first half. He says that that consciousness in the first line, end, that consciousness is sarva bhutastaha. It abides in sarva bhuta, in all beings. We've discussed before, one all-pervasive consciousness, manifest in all living beings. But here's the important distinction. That consciousness is, second line in, it is vivarjitaha, it is free from bhuta doshaihi, it is free from the defects of those beings. Consciousness, one all-pervasive consciousness dwells in us all. And I'm just getting a humorous image. Suppose consciousness was affected by every person in whose mind that consciousness dwelled. How many people in this world? 7 billion. How many of those 7 billion people have terrible problems? 99% of those 7 billion people have. So consciousness dwelling in the minds of 7 billion people with problems, that consciousness would be in bad shape if it were affected by all of that. But clearly, that all-pervasive consciousness remains utterly unaffected by the defects of the beings in which it dwells. And to put this on a personal level, your consciousness is utterly unaffected by sadness when it arises in your mind, by pain when it arises in your mind, by any experience you have, consciousness remains utterly unaffected. How? First word, vyoma-vat. Vyoma, space. We'll take it in a sense of space. Space abides in all beings. Space is inside here. If this body has a problem, how does that affect the space that abides inside this problem? You get the idea. Space remains utterly unaffected by whatever it dwells in. In the same way, consciousness remains utterly unaffected by whatever it dwells in. Now, I made a brief reference in last week's class where we were talking about Shankara's deft use of Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. We've talked about this important topic several times. These three are the foundation on which the teachings of Vedanta stand. They stand on Shruti, scriptural revelation, Yukti, reasoning, and Anubhava, experience. Whatever is taught in Vedanta must be supported by all three. It must be scripturally revealed, it must be reasonable, and it must be consistent with your experience. Now, we've talked about this before. What I'd like to show you in this verse is something about Shankara's greatness. In one verse, he uses all three, Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava, in one verse. Look at the last line, Shruti first. Brahma eva asmi. Where do we come to know that the consciousness present in your experience right now, the consciousness that you think is something ordinary, the rishis discovered that so-called ordinary consciousness to be extraordinary. They discovered it to be Brahman. And the only way we have of discovering that is through the Shruti, the teachings that convey to us this discovery of the ancient rishis. So, last line is Shruti. First line, vyoma-vat. It's a comparison. Comparison is yukti, reasoning. Vyoma-vat, reasoning. And then third line, sakshi-cheta, experience. Your experience of yourself as an awareful being. So in one verse, Sri Shankara very deftly makes use of all three, Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava. Next. Nama-rupa kriya-bhyonyo, Nama-rupa kriyo-bhyonyo, nitya-mukta-swarupavan, nitya-mukta-swarupavan, ahamatma param brahma, ahamatma param brahma, chinmatroham sadadvayaha, chinmatroham sadadvayaha. Start again in the third line. Aham atma. I am that conscious self. I am param brahma. Sounds a little bit like the prior verse. I am that absolute reality called Brahman. Chinmatraha aham. I am pure consciousness, and nothing else. And aham, I am sada, always, advayaha, always non-dual. Once again, Shankara is using first person, but again, this is not for the sake of nididhyasana. It's always contextual. So Shankara is continuing to teach us here. What is he teaching us, and how is he teaching us? This is a style of teaching where Shankaracharya is something we forget. Shankaracharya is speaking to us through this text. And when he says, aham chinmatraha, I am pure consciousness, aham brahma, I am Brahman, Shankaracharya is teaching us what he himself has discovered. We call this vidvat anubhava, the experience of an enlightened person. And this is a very, very important principle that we overlook. We spend our whole lifetime learning from others. Do we not? When we're little children, we learn from our parents and teachers. Later, we learned, at a professional level, we learn from colleagues. Here, we're talking about learning from those who are enlightened. That's what this verse is about. Shankara is teaching us based on his own personal experience. Now, be careful. When we use experience, we don't mean, as I said at the beginning of the class, not experience of Brahman. We're not talking about that kind of experience because there's no such thing as experience of Brahman, because the experiencer is Brahman. So don't make that mistake. But this verse represents, instead of calling it experience, let us call it Shankaracharya's worldview. How does his mind think? How does Shankara think? Let's see the verse again with that in mind. We already saw third line. Aham atma, Shankara's mind thinks. I am not this body and mind. I am pure consciousness, param brahma, and that consciousness is identical to the underlying reality because of which everything exists. Chinmatraha aham, I am pure consciousness. Sada advayaha, as non-dual Brahman, there is only that reality. And then back up to the top. Nama, rupa, kriyabhyaha, anyaha. I am anyaha, other than nama, name, rupa, form, kriya, action, movement, referring to the whole world in which we live. Nama, rupa, and movement. And he says, I am nitya mukta, he likes that expression anyway, nitya mukta swarupavan. I am one whose swarupa, my true nature, is nitya mukta, eternally liberated, always free. What that means is if Shankara were here speaking English, Shankara would say, I never got enlightened. Huh? Say what? Nitya muktaha. Consciousness doesn't get enlightened. Consciousness never got into samsara. Consciousness never suffered in the first place. So the problem, to use Pujya Swamiji Dayananda's wonderful expression, the problem is self-non-recognition. When you fail to recognize your true nature, all these problems occur. When you recognize your true nature, to go back to our dream metaphor, it's like waking out of a nightmare. In fact, this is my funny impression of what it is to be enlightened. Many people think, oh, it's such a wonderful, extraordinary, uplifting, transcendent, life-transforming, and then to some measure all of that is true. But I think the more accurate expression of enlightenment would be like this. What an idiot I've been! Honestly. How could I be so ignorant to take all of this as being absolutely real? As a final comment, when I first met Pujya Swami Dayananda, and I had already been studying Vedanta for a while, and that actually was crucial because the first time I heard him speak, I just had a sense, an intuitive sense, he's got it. And then the next thought is, whatever he has, I want. So, right? That's natural. And that's why Shankaracharya here is sharing his worldview. Because when you see that, you recognize, that's what I want. This is what Shankaracharya sees. I want to see what Shankaracharya sees. I want the same world view as Shankaracharya. Okay, next two verses go together, and it's a little different subject matter. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on Shruti, on scripture, in these two verses. Aham brahmasmi karta cha, aham brahmasmi karta cha, bhokta chasmi tiye viduhu, bhokta chasmi tiye viduhu, te nashta jnana karmabhyam, te nashta jnana karmabhyam, nasti kasyurna samshayah, nasti kasyurna samshayah. Before seeing the verse, we need some introduction here. You already know that the Vedas have a karma kanda and a jnana kanda. The karma kanda are the rituals. The jnana kanda are the spiritual teachings, like what we're studying. The purpose of the karma kanda is, we'll just do it in a simplified form. The purpose of the karma kanda is to teach you how to do all these rituals so you can go to heaven. It's simplified, but that's more or less the sense. The purpose of the jnana kanda is to give you this knowledge, remove the so-called veil of ignorance, so you can gain moksha. So the purpose of the karma kanda is going to heaven. Again, that's oversimplified. The purpose of the jnana kanda is moksha. These are two mutually exclusive purposes, which means you can only pursue one or the other, not both. The pursuit, the performance of rituals for the sake of going to heaven will prevent you from gaining moksha. Your commitment to gaining moksha will prevent you from doing rituals for the sake of going to heaven. So you have one goal. It's like when you're driving. So if you're driving, let's see. So suppose you have two choices. You can drive east to New York City. You can drive sort of west, sort of east, and sort of west you can go to Arshavidya Gurukulam, our parent ashram. So if you're going to drive east, you have one goal. Driving west, you have the other goal. You can't go to both simultaneously. You choose one goal and pursue that. But there are some cases of confusion with regard to this jnana kanda and karma kanda. And that is, some people wanted both ways. What do they say? And funny American expression I've never understood. To have your cake and eat it too. What in the world does that mean? I have no idea. But that seems to apply here. Anyway, let's see what Shankara is teaching us here. He says, end of the second line, ye viduhu. There are some people who think what? Aham Brahma Asmi. I am Brahman, they think. Karta cha, and they also think Karta bhokta cha asmi. I'm also the agent of action and the recipient of the results. Karta, agent of action, bhokta, recipient of the results. Now, Shankaracharya is talking about the followers of the jnana kanda who gain the knowledge aham brahmasmi, and followers of the karma kanda who understand themselves to be a karta, an agent of action, specifically doing rituals, and bhokta, the recipient of the results of those actions, specifically going to heaven. And here's the problem. You can't pursue both of these mutually exclusive goals at the same time. You know, this cake metaphor I don't understand, but there's another metaphor that's much more vivid. If there are two boats side by side, small boats like canoes or rowboats side by side, you've got 1 foot on one boat and 1 foot in the other boat. Not a good plan. But that's what Shankara is describing. Someone who wants both. And maybe it's because they don't trust the jnana kanda to deliver moksha, so they want a backup plan of going to swarga. There's no backup plan. So you have to put, and all these silly American metaphors, put all your eggs in one basket. How many more silly metaphors am I going to use? Anyway, enough. But the point here is you have to choose your direction in life. Do you want to seek worldly enjoyment? Go for it. Do you want to seek heaven? Why not? Do you want to seek moksha? Wonderful. But choose. Be deliberate. Open your eyes to the fact that we have these choices. Most people don't even recognize that they have these choices. Step 1, recognize what is your ultimate goal in life. And Shankara observes about these people who, let's say they're unclear about their goals in lives. And Shankara says, te nashtaha. They are nashtaha, they have here fallen away, jnana karma bhyam. They've fallen away both from the jnana kanda and the karma kanda. They've fallen away both from pursuing moksha and from pursuing swarga, heaven. They're really confused. Here's an important point, and I missed this before. The karma kanda is meant to serve the needs of a certain group of people. The jnana kanda is meant to serve the spiritual needs of a different group of people, and these groups are non-overlapping. If you remember Venn diagrams, so here we have two non-overlapping realms. So you are either in one camp or another. You are either a seeker of heaven, and you are guided by the karma kanda, or you are a seeker of moksha, and you are guided by the jnana kanda, one or the other. But Shankara here is describing those who are confused, and they're not truly following either of these. Shankara says they have fallen away both from karma and jnana, both from the karma kanda and the jnana kanda, and Shankara concludes, nastikaha syuhu. He said they are functionally non-believers. Now, astika, many of you know it's in vernacular languages as well. Astik and Nastik, it comes in Hindi and other languages. And translated properly as believer and non-believer. But something you should know, and that is in biblical culture, those words have a very different meaning. In biblical culture, a Gnostic is someone who doesn't believe in God. In biblical culture, an Astik is someone who does believe in God. In Hindu culture, a Gnostic is someone who doesn't believe in the scriptures. See the difference? So Gnostic and Astik, Nastika, you'll use the Sanskrit forms, Nastika and Astika in the Hindu tradition are not with regard to God or Ishvara, they're with regard to scriptures. And Astika is one who acknowledges the validity of the scriptures, both karma kanda and jnana kanda. A Nastika is one who rejects the authoritativeness of the scriptures, both karma kanda and jnana kanda. Okay, we'll see one more verse. Dharma dharma palayar yoga, dharma dharma palayar yoga, ishto drishto yatatmanaha, ishto drishto yatatmanaha, shastrat brahmattvamapyasya, shastrat brahmattvamapyasya, moksho jnanatateshyatam. Moksho jnanatateshyatam. There's usually when the commentator, when a commentator will introduce a verse like this, the commentator will try to figure out what was on Shankaracharya's mind when he's writing this verse. And sometimes the commentators are very insightful, sometimes not so anyway. But that's kind of an interesting challenge for any teacher, is to try to imagine what was in Shankaracharya's mind when he wrote this. And I think what was in Shankaracharya's mind is a problem for the followers of the Karmakanda, so that they're seekers of Swarga, but then they also know that the latter part of the Vedas, the Jnana-kanda, teaches, I am Brahman. How do they're called karma-kandis, or karmis, the ones who follow the ritualistic part of the Vedas. How do they interpret when they're studying the Vedas, do this ritual, do this ritual, do this meditation, do this prayer, etc., and then they get to the part, I am Brahman, Tattvamasi, you are that. How do they interpret that? Well, in ancient times, maybe I don't know about today, in ancient times, they tried to twist it in a way and make them into meditations that were meant to accompany the performance of rituals. Now, this is a little archaic, I know, but in ancient times, it was a big thing. That is, the followers of the Karmakanda would deliberately distort the meaning of the Jnana-kanda and say, these are not instructions of spiritual wisdom, of spiritual truth. Instead, these are, they'd use the term upasana, meditations. And the meditations found in the so-called Jnana-kanda, those meditations are meant to support the rituals found in the Jnana-kanda. I think that's what Shankaracharya had in mind when he wrote this verse. Let's see what he says here. He says, start in the second line, yatha atmanaha. Just to get the big picture, in the second line, yatha, and in the last line, tata ishyatam. So we're getting another drishtanta and darshtanta. Yatha introduces the drishtanta, tata introduces the darshtanta. So yatha, just as atmanaha, for oneself, there is the dharma, adharma, palaihi, yogaha. For oneself there is yoga. Yoga here means getting connected. Getting connected with what? Phala, the results. The results of what? Dharma and adharma, the good and bad karmas, the results of the good and bad deeds you have committed in life. So yatha, just as atmanaha yogaha, your connection with the good and bad karmas from prior deeds, those good and bad karmas are, can you see karmas? Can you know what your karmas are? In fact, it's so significant that those karmas are actually called adrishta, the word in the second line. Adrishta literally means that which can't be seen, and then by extension it's used as a name for karma. Karma is called adrishta, imperceivable. You cannot perceive in any way whatsoever the karmas. Then how do you know They exist. How do you know that if you hurt someone, you will incur papa karma? How do you know if you do all these rituals, you will accumulate punya karma and perhaps go to heaven? How do you know? Well, through the scripture. So this, you know, this connection to good and bad karmas, this is adrishta, and it is ishtaha, it is accepted shastrat from the scriptures. You come to know through the scriptures that there is such a thing as adrishta, the good and bad karmas that can affect you. And for that reason, then you might be motivated to not cause harm to others. You might be motivated to do these rituals. That motivation comes from the scripture, and that motivation is with regard to something that is adrishta. That's a key point, and we'll see that in the second half. Now that is the drishtanta, the metaphor. Now we come to the darshtanta, what the metaphor represents. And in the last line, tata, in the same way. Now back up, you have to jump around with me a little bit. End of the third line, asya, for that person, asya atmanaha, for that person, api, breaking apart all these words, brahmatvam, api, asya, breaking the words apart, api, also, tata, in the same way, also in the same way, shastrat, from the scriptures, ishtaha, you come to know and accept brahmatvam. Brahmatvam, your nature as Brahman, taught in the Jnana Kanda. Also, moksha jnanat, the fact that liberation, moksha, comes from knowledge. All of this is known. Shastrat ishyatam, breaking words apart again, tata, ishyatam. So from the scriptures, one comes to know that that you are Brahman is known from the scriptures, and that moksha is a result of knowledge, comes from the scriptures. Now here's the point. I'm not sure. It's a little sophisticated. Here's what Shankara wants you to understand. If you accept, and he's addressing those karma kandis who said that the Upanishads were meant for meditation. The Upanishads were not meant for spiritual knowledge. So Shankara addresses them, and he says, well, wait a minute. You accept the karma kanda as being a pramana, a valid source of knowledge. Is that not correct? Let's just put this in an imaginary discussion between Shankaracharya and this ritualist. So Shankaracharya says, do you accept the authoritativeness of the Vedas? He says, yes. Do you accept the fact that the Vedas tell you that for your harmful deeds, you will receive papa karmas? For your good deeds, you will receive punya karmas, and that is revealed by the karma kanda of the Vedas. Do you accept that? He says, yes. Then Shankara says, well, tell me, if you accept the authoritativeness of the karma kanda, why do you not accept the authoritativeness of the jnana kanda? Why do you reject statements like tattvamasi and turn them into some kind of meditation by twisting their meaning? By the way, you have to twist in order to get that interpretation of meditation. When you study those scriptures, they're not talking about meditations meant to accompany the rituals. Absolutely not. But this is the twisting that was done in ancient times. So Shankara says, if you accept the authoritativeness of the portion of the Vedas that teaches you that teaches you about adrishta, let's come back to that word. Adrishta meaning karma. Tell me, is enlightenment? It's a little tricky. Can you tell whether or not I'm enlightened by looking at me? With children, I used to joke, an enlightened person is one who glows in the dark. Turn off the lights, and then you can test to see whether or not you get the point. Whether or not someone is enlightened for you is adrishta. You can't see. You have no way of knowing. So this is a parallel that Shankara wants to describe. And that is the karma kanda deals with one kind of adrishta called karma. The jnana kanda deals with a different kind of adrishta, not really the same, but the idea is that moksha is not a thing you can see. So in that sense, it's an adrishta. And Shankara's conclusion here is that if you accept the karma kanda as being authoritative, you have no right to reject the authoritativeness of the jnana kanda which teaches you are Brahman. That is knowledge, that is not meant for meditation. Okay, this is a good place to conclude. We'll end with our prayers. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om tat sat.